Who ran the Iron Horse? A lyric from the 1969 song Cabin Essence by the Beach Boys. You'd be forgiven for thinking such an odd lyric is nothing more than a piece of psychedelic songwriting from the band's experimental era. In reality, though, the track presents a story, an abstract image of a time long past. According to Brian Wilson himself, Cabin Essence is about railroads. He spoke of how the image of an iron horse thundering along the rails played in his mind, and how he imagines the piece being written from the perspective of an immigrant worker observing the world around him as he hammers down the spikes. Stories of the building of great railways have been present in our culture for well over a century, but there are few countries as intrinsically tied to them as Canada. Our nation and the province of British Columbia wouldn't exist without the founding of the CPR, Canadian Pacific Railway, now known as the CPKC. But that's not the story I'm here to tell. There's another railway of historical significance to Canada and BC that just so happens to be right here in White Rock, weaving its way from the evergreen state of Washington all the way to the city of Vancouver. Let's talk White Rock. Let's go back a bit. It's the late 19th century. Not literally, but you get what I mean. James Jerome Hill is a railroad tycoon, Minnesota's most aggressive railwayman according to the Dictionary of Canadian Biographies. Wait a second, if he's from Minnesota, why does the DCB talk about him? Good question. Hill was actually born in Canada, which makes this next bit all the more interesting. William Cornelius Van Horn was also a railroad tycoon, but where Hill was a Canadian living in the US, Van Horn was an American living in Canada. Anyways, the pair worked together in the early days of the CPR, Van Horn overseeing construction on the project. For a time, there was peace. Hill even endorsed his good buddy to become the chairman of the CPR committee. But then, like a dagger through the heart, Hill was betrayed by the one man he called his friend. Kind of. You see, there were two routes in consideration for the CPR, one to the north of Lake Superior and one to the south through the US. The northern route would traverse through the barren wasteland known as the Canadian Shield, where the southern route would connect with the railroads in the US. Van Horn was tied to Option A. It was a condition of his contract the railway follow the northern alignment, plus it would be far quicker to build. This did not make Hill happy. Not one bit. It got worse when Van Horn started buying lines to the south of the border, as he believed if a freight rate war were to happen, he could fight for control to and from the west of the continent, temporarily avoiding that northern Superior line. Hill called it an invasion, and filled with irreconcilable rage, he began plotting his revenge. After resigning from the CPR in 1883, he created his masterwork, a transcontinental railway of his own, the Great Northern Railway. For a time, the GNR was confined to the United States, but eventually the decision was made to expand it back into Hill's home country. In 1891, the New Westminster Southern Railway officially opened. It ran from Blaine in Washington state through White Rock, eventually terminating in the at-the-time hub of the Lower Mainland, New Westminster. Ha! Except that's not what actually happened. The line actually skirted around White Rock through the Douglas neighborhood on its way to Cloverdale. Obviously, that route didn't last, so what happened? Well, as it turns out, the steep grade in Hazelmere became a bit of an issue facing the railway's efficiency. In fact, it was one of the steepest sections of track on the Vancouver to Seattle route. How did James Hill not see that coming? The final nail in the coffin for this section of the route was the New Westminster Bridge, opened in 1904. If the route was moved along the Samiamu First Nation Reserve, through a small settlement on Boundary Bay, and around the north shore of Mud Bay, the track could be shortened by kilometers, with the added benefit of ocean access. That tiny community was the seaside village of White Rock, and by tiny I mean 7. Not 7,700 and not quite just 7 people, but 7 families. Yeah. From the perspective of the residents, the railroad passing through would lead to commerce and prosperity. Land speculators saw dollar signs. White Rock could be the next big Pacific port. Yeah, that part didn't happen. H.T. Thrift was an early supporter of the project on one condition. The access to the beach needed to be considered when building the line. I guess the GNR forgot about that part though, as when construction began in 1906, a massive wooden wall was erected along the waterfront. I thought these boulders made it hard to get to the beach. Dynamite was used to blast away parts of the hill, and after a few minor setbacks, Engine 954 proudly made the maiden voyage of the new line on March 15, 1909, forever changing the once isolated community of White Rock. Back in the old days, it was Canadian customs policy to have a port of entry a certain distance away from the border, so when the railway opened in 1909, a crewed station was there to greet passengers on opening day. Didn't last very long though, as a new station was built in 1912, opening on New Year's Day of 1913.
Now here's a fact you might not know, which is very impressive because that implies you knew everything I've already told you. Must be very smart. I myself have an IQ of 57.
Anyways, when planning for the station, White Rock was concerned that the railway depot in Blaine was too close to East Beach. That, combined with the regulations on distance of the port of entry from the border, resulted in the station's location on West Beach, which had the effect of making it a heck of a lot busier than the East. The east wing of the building itself handled immigration and customs, including jail cells that were often used to lock up all manner of freight hoppers and rod riders found inside or beneath empty boxcars. Nowadays, this area is home to the offices and archives of the White Rock Museum, with the exhibit hall located in the left wing where waiting rooms and communications equipment once were.
The breezeway in the center of the building was filled in 1949 and then reopened in 2010 as the cutest little gift shop this side the Fraser River. It's funny because this is about trains and there's a train.
Although all manner of freight passed along the 4-kilometer stretch of track through White Rock, the most important import was people. Remember Engine 954, the first train to use the line? It carried 4 passenger cars. For decades, people from the neighboring communities in the Lower Mainland and Washington State flocked to White Rock, as it was quickly becoming one of BC's premier vacation spots. In the 40s, the high-tech diesel locomotives, the International and the Canadian, or the American if you were headed south, stopped at the depot each day on their way between Seattle and Vancouver. White Rock and the railway seemed to work in harmony for a time, but things weren't as peachy as they seemed. Great Northern owned the land around the tracks, as most railways do. When the fire brigade wanted to build a new hose shed, they had to go to the GNR. The railway didn't even seem interested in maintaining level crossings. For a time, the wooden planks between the tracks were removed and never replaced, much to the chagrin of anyone trying to access the beach. The GNR itself ceased operations in 1970. Well, kind of. It merged with a handful of other railroads to form the Burlington Northern Railway, which after another merger with Santa Fe became BNSF, which means that technically the GNR has been in control of the line in one form or another for well over a century. Impressive. In the early 70s, the American government moved to abolish privatized passenger rail service, creating Amtrak in its place. They seemingly forgot that passenger lines ran between the US, Canada, and Mexico, so no funding was allocated to those services outside the states. Service to White Rock would briefly resume, but by 1975, the last train had come and gone from the station, never to return again. In the modern age, the status quo has remained largely unchanged. Sure, more trains frequent the line, and in the early 1990s, fences began to be erected around the tracks, as well as crossing barriers and lights. But the railway has kind of been static since then. That is with the exception of one major addition. A wild Amtrak cascades. For decades, these foreign creatures native to the vast expanse of Oregon country make the daily migration up through White Rock to their feeding grounds in Vancouver. In 2009, the service was expanded to include direct routes from Vancouver to Portland. I couldn't figure out a way to make that last part sound like a David Attenborough nature documentary. So, what does the future hold for the White Rock Railway? Well, it's hard to say. 10 years ago, I might have told you the railroad might not last through the end of the decade, as a push to align the tracks closer with their original orientation away from the beach was being seriously considered. In fact, there's been several attempts to reroute the railway dating back to the 60s, one proposal from 1968 even suggesting a causeway through the bay.
I don't think that would have made the situation any better.
Alas, the tracks still remain, and without any passenger service, their importance to White Rock dwindled. There was an attempt to reignite service in 2001 between Washington and White Rock, but come September, the plans changed, as did the world. But avid transit enthusiasts haven't given up yet, as there have been many ideas and proposals for service to return.
If only Metro Vancouver had a criminally underutilized commuter rail service already. Oh wait, we do.
Now, I don't know how feasible expanding the West Coast Express to the south of the Fraser region would be, so I asked an expert. Arden English of the Greater Discussions YouTube channel is a guru when it comes to transportation, and as a White Rock resident, I'm sure he'll be able to shed some light on the matter. Too bad he was in Toronto the 1 week we were recording.
Hi, my name is Arden English. Thank you so much for having me on. You've caught me on a GO train, Toronto's far more competent regional rail network. This outclasses the West Coast Express in pretty much every way, despite running the exact same kind of trains. I think that long term, it is a good idea to try and expand West Coast Express all over the region, not just south of Fraser, although arguably south of Fraser is where it's needed the most. That is where the most population growth is happening, and maybe not so much towards White Rock, but towards Langley, Abbotsford, eastbound directions. There's definitely a case to be made for higher levels of service. The issue is that there's only one rail crossing that exists right now between the north of Fraser and the south of Fraser, and that's at New Westminster, and it's a single lane bridge or a single tracked bridge that has a very low speed limit. That would need to be completely replaced, whether it's by another bridge or by an underground tunnel. That's a really expensive project that we're now talking about. There's also the issue that there just aren't a lot of track options. Unlike Toronto, where there's a multitude of different tracks going east, going west, going north, going south, all over that GO trains can use, Vancouver just doesn't have that kind of flexibility. Vancouver is a much newer city that wasn't built with the same mentality in a time as Toronto. And so Toronto was just built with much more rail infrastructure out of the gate. You can see pretty briefly how fast the train is moving. Amtrak Cascades very rarely gets to this speed on the Canadian side of the border because the tracks are too windy, not very straight, or just not in great condition. And all of that would have to be fixed before you can do any kind of substantial upgrades to rapid transit by rail in the south of Fraser region, let alone having to compete with BNSF or Canadian National.
No matter how you feel about the railway in White Rock, there is no doubt about its importance to the city's history. Just as the Iron Horse played a role in creating the province of BC, it also played a huge role in creating the White Rock that we know and love today. Freight and passenger trains still rumble through the city each and every day, reminding us of a closer connection that once existed between the railway and the community. For some, the trains are a noisy, dusty backdrop to everyday life, but to others, it's an iconic White Rock attraction in and of itself. No one can predict what the future holds for the railroad, but there's no denying the impact it's had on White Rock's past.